Thank you for joining us today for our monthly Harris County Democratic Lawyer, along with Texas Democratic Lawyer presentation. We'll, as before, give you 40 seconds to load on what looks like a very good crowd for today before we get started. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started today. Before we start with the main program with Harris County Democratic Party Chair Lillie Schechter and Delilah Agho-Otoghile, who's going to be really delving into the numbers, kind of what a lot of us have been waiting to see, why things happen, good and bad, in Harris County in November. We're joined by Justice Megan Hassan from the 14th Court of Appeals. There's, not surprisingly, because it's every other year, bad things afoot in the legislature, and in particular things that are attempting in many ways to undo the hard work that so many of you have contributed to electing justices that are looking to render justice in a fair and impartial way. And Justice Hassan is one of those who joined the court in 2018, the 14th Court of Appeals, and is going to visit with you about something that we wouldn't be doing our job if we didn't flag how important it is to be heard on this particular legislative reworking and what it's going to do to the Court of Appeals and the face potentially of justice in Texas and Harris County. Thank you, Justice Hassan.
Thank you, Mike. I have a quick presentation. I know that you're very excited to hear Lillie and Delilah speak today. So thank you for letting me speak. So what I wanted to talk about was SB 11. It is the Texas Appellate Redistricting Bill. It was filed as a shell bill back in January and is now rocketing its way through the legislature. It was passed out of the Senate Jurisprudence Committee last Thursday. It has not yet had a schedule for a full Senate hearing, and it's in the House Redistricting Committee. And as you can see, it would move the Courts of Appeals District from 14, the 1st and the 14th, which is now in Houston, would be expanded to this large area. So we would be getting 20 counties in our Houston district with a new courthouse with 3 justices taken from San Antonio, Austin, and Fort Worth in Lake Jackson. Lake Jackson doesn't even have a courthouse at this time, so there would have to be a new courthouse built. It would be 7 appellate court districts total, and it would basically concentrate power in large cities. If you can see from the map, the Dallas-Austin Court of Appeals, which would be the new 5th Court of Appeals, would be a Democratic sync district, as would the 3rd San Antonio, Corpus, and Edinburgh. Houston would be impossible for a Democrat to be elected in Houston in this district. The other problem is with rural areas. The rural areas in Eastland and Waco and Texarkana, Beaumont, they would be overwhelmed by voters from the large cities in those districts. And so they would also lose their justices. So this is not a great plan for anyone. And so what we are looking to do, these are just some quick facts. I've given this presentation to Mike to send out to everyone. This is the legislation. It's SB 11 in the legislature. And then the companion bills in the House are HB 339 and HB 2613. The reasoning for this is ostensibly because there are too many conflicts in the courts of appeals and the Supreme Court can't resolve them all. So those of you, I know that some of you who are on are judges in Harris County and elsewhere. And so what we really need from everyone who's on this call is to call your Texas senators, call your representatives, tell them that it's not good for most of those people who live in cities, but also that it's really not great for rural Texans. If you're available, we would love to have you testify at the House Redistricting Committee. It hasn't been scheduled yet, but I will keep you up to date on that. And just let everybody in your networks know that this is just a bad plan for most Texans. This wasn't presented to any shareholders, no lawyers, no judges, no justices on the courts of appeals heard about this until Tuesday of last week. And so, like I said, they're just trying to push this through and change the appellate system in Texas, it would basically get rid of all precedent as well. So especially if you're a judge, we're looking for testimony, we're looking for support on this. So just get in touch with me if you need. And Mike, like I said, I've given you and your people the full presentation. So please feel free to pass it around to the members.
Thank you, Justice. One question, Justice. So if it's not good for most Texans, who is it good for?
It's good for Republicans in large cities. So the bill was proposed by Joan Huffman, who is a senator here in Houston, Fort Bend County, Brazoria. So,
and one other question, and we are going to post on our Facebook and as well as our site a contact for you, if that's okay, that you'll share with us. And then also we'll make sure we have the full presentation. The follow-up question obviously is, what will it do to the Houston Court of Appeals?
So we would keep our seats until our next election, and then we would be forced to campaign and win in the new 30 county district. And so starting in 2022, the new 30 county district would be what the candidates would be campaigning for. And so anyone who wanted to run as a Democrat for those seats, which are all now currently held by Republicans, would have to campaign in Montgomery County all the way out to Guadalupe County near San Antonio, and all the way as far south as Victoria and Goliad counties. So
Got
it's
it.
a massive geographic district.
Right. And so in terms of the makeup, obviously it's pretty clear that somebody took maps and figured out this it. Thank you so much for kind of spotlighting this issue. And I think this is really one of those ones that the more folks look at it, both rural folks, our folks, it's really something that can only happen if they kind of do it in the middle of the night, so to speak. And so your shining light on this is much appreciated. And we'll get that stuff up on the Facebook site as soon as we finish today so that y'all have an opportunity to be heard. And it really is something where it's helped to be heard. Thank you very much, Justice Hassan, for hollering about this.
Thank you.
Next, we have a very brief message from, or not very brief, we have an important but brief message from Jaime Mercado with Sisters United. Jaime's been involved, and many of y'all know him politically here in Harris County in many successful campaigns for Democrats. But what's really important in 2020 is the work that Art Cronin, Sheree Matula, and the other folks with Sisters United did to bring out voters that literally can make the difference in our county elections countywide by focusing on voters that aren't there all the time but need to be. Thank you, Jaime, for joining us today.
Thank y'all for having me. I'm going to share a screen here so that we can follow along. Okay, so tell y'all a little bit about Sisters United. So it's a women's voter outreach program that's here locally, born and bred in Texas. It started in 2016 with a simple idea from some local activists. A lot of people know Diane Mosier, the late Diane Mosier, who was a Democratic stalwart here. She just came up with the basic idea, why aren't we talking to Democratic women just because they're out in the suburbs? When I first got into politics, it was very geographic. So I was told, don't go talk to people in this part of town or that part of town because you're wasting your time. Well, you know, she decided, let's go talk to these women. And there was some great success in 2016. In 2018, she asked me and another consultant named Diana Patino to come on board and rework the program a little bit. And we decided to really focus on a universe of women who had not been voting in major elections, but were already registered. So the hard work is done, they're registered. And now, because of the databases we have scores indicating that these women are highly likely to be Democrats. We just got to get them to the polls. And for whatever reason, they weren't responding to big campaigns. So we set out to do that in 2018, had some good success. 2020, we decided we were really going to go in and expand. So we identified over 1 million women that fit that criteria. And when we were done with our fundraising, it allowed us to target 416,000 women that had not voted in any of the 2 general elections, 18 or 16. 85% of these women were registered for all those elections. They just chose not to vote in Hillary versus Trump or Beto O'Rourke, $80 million, the resistance, all that was going on, these women still were not motivated to come vote. So we raised over $900,000 in the cycle. We expanded to 26 counties. We were going to send them over 1 million mail pieces. We were going to attempt over 500,000 live call attempts. We were when it was all said and done, 17 million digital impressions and 300,000 video views. So what were we sending these women? We were sending them a message that we thought was a little unique. We will get polling from publicly available polling that a lot of Democratic consultants have access to, but we always rework it in-house a bit. And one of the things we saw was everyone was tying the pandemic to healthcare. We thought we would get more pull from our targets if we tied it to the economic issue. And I think that turned out to be the right move, because we hear now that the main thing that we're talking about as far as women in the pandemic is how they've been disproportionately affected economically by the pandemic. And that's the message we were going with. And I think we got some pretty good response from our targets when we talk to them about the economic issues. And that's kind of what Sisters United does. We really tailor it to these women that are not responding to candidates. We're encouraging to vote Democratic, but we're really talking to them about their issues on their level. So what were the results? So out of 416,000 women, we were able to get, or we had a hand in turning out 121,770 of them. That's a 29% turnout rate. So these are women that, again, sat out some of the biggest elections in recent history, and they finally came out to the polls. Now, some people will remind us, well, this was the biggest election in history, so weren't they going to come out anyway? Well, their history is telling us that they were likely to stay at home. But when I compare it to some control groups of similar women that did not receive the Sisters United program, we outperformed those control groups by about 20%. So Sisters United definitely had an impact on these low propensity women voters. And now we hope to keep them on the voter rolls. A side note, very late in the game, we got some late money flushed in. So what we did is we set up a digital only program. So these women didn't get mail and phone calls, but they got digital starting about October 20th. And that was another 71,000 women separate from this 4,100 universe. And we got 19,472 of them to turn out. So that was still a 27% turnout rate with a strictly digital program, which I think kind of lends to the future of campaigns and how much weight we put on digital versus mail. So a lot of lessons to learn here. This is great. We turned out this many women. Why didn't we do better? Well, when we ran the numbers on the Republican side, a similar universe of Republican leaning women, they had over 300,000 across the state. So a lot of resources on their side. We can't ever discount how much they're putting into these elections as well.
Thank you, Jaime. Two questions. One, because I've heard these before, bang for the buck. In other words, how much did this cost to bring out how many voters that would not otherwise have been there likely, but for this?
So our comprehensive program with the mail, the phone calls, and the digital, because we were able to raise those huge sums of money, you get to talk to more people, which brings your per cost down. So those women got their 3 mail pieces, digital and phone calls for about $1.82 each.
And when you say that how many voters that using these metrics would not have been out there voting more likely than not for Democratic candidates are we talking?
Oh, well, the history of these women is they were staying home. So I can't for a fact say that all 120,000 of them would stay home. But if they were not motivated by $80 million campaigns from Beto and Hillary and Trump, then comparing to the control group, at least there would have been a 20% drop in these women turning out.
Right. So what you're talking about, a buck 80 for 120,000 voters who hadn't shown up in 2018, hadn't showed up for these important elections before.
$1.82 for attempting all those contacts with them. If we narrow it down to the cost per vote that is produced, it's about $6.87, which is still actually remarkably low. But I think, of course, this helps that we were in the biggest election in history.
Since 2018, at least.
Yes.
Thank you, Jaime. Now we're going to start with the main course for today, which is something that at least from many of the folks I've talked to has been on our minds since November is, things were great. We kind of, at least for a while, thought we had a new president, and we did in fact have a new president take office January 20th. But how come things didn't work out as well as we hoped they might have in November, not just across the state, not just in Zapata County that we heard from earlier this year, but what worked and what worked number wise. And we have the two ladies today that are going to give us that data, give us those numbers to kind of identify where, as a party, as those who run for office, things have worked well, and where there needs to be extra work, extra resources, hopefully from some of y'all on this to address it. So we're joined by Lillie Schechter, our Harris County Democratic Chair since 2017, a second generation chair for the party, which is saying something. And what it means, what it says is that she's whole in. She's whole hog on pushing for the Democratic Party and the candidates and the things that we stand for as a party here. She's joined by our Interim Executive Director, Delilah Agho-Otoghile, who's a native Texan who, among her many claims to fame, was instrumental in Vote Simple, a digital voter registration project which brought out voters, but more directly participated as the executive director for Win Justice, over $32 million that was invested in getting President Biden elected across the Midwest, Wisconsin, other states where those important states need to be done. Thank you so much for joining us, Lillie and Delilah, and we look forward to hearing what you have to share. And as always, about 12:45, we'll be taking plenty of questions. And if you don't forget, please put your questions in early, because we'll go off the list. And so the sooner you get them in, the sooner we'll make sure that we get them addressed. Thank you, Lillie. Thank you, Delilah, for joining us.
Thank you, Mike, so much for having us on today. Delilah and I are very excited to give this presentation. I'm just going to do a brief introduction and then let Delilah take it over, because she is queen of the numbers at the Democratic Party. I do want to start off and say that one of the things that we are so excited about at the Democratic Party is that we are building a brand and building a team to do this work 365 days out of the year. We don't just start in September to reach our voters. We are contacting them every day. And we've been doing that at the party since 2017 with a full staff of amazing team members that have been there for the last 2 to 4 years to make sure that we are reaching voters all over the county and continuing to build our coalition and make sure that our coalition of Democrats is stronger and stronger. We're going to go through the numbers today to give you an idea of what we did in 2020 and what the trends look like in Harris County from 16, 18, 20, and moving forward, because what we have to make sure is that everything we're doing is focused towards the 2022 election. Every election cycle at the party, we do a post-election analysis to make sure that we're looking back to see what we did well and looking at the historical vote trends, and then building a program to make sure that we win the next election cycle. And our next election cycle in 2022 is going to be, I think, one of the fights of our lifetimes in Harris County. We have talked a little bit about how the results in 20 weren't exactly what we wanted. I mean, we won the county hands down with huge margins. Without straight ticket voting, we were able to deliver every county-wide position in the county. We had some House races that didn't turn out so well, and there's some interesting trends that we're going to talk about today in some of those House races and around the county, things that we need to be aware of as we're continuing to build for 2022. So one of the things we are going to drop into the chat is a donation link to the party, because we are a year-round operation. We don't just start towards September and go through November. We actually work every day gearing up towards the next election. And so we will drop in a link at some point to make sure that we have all of your support, because we appreciate everything HCDLA does and want to make sure that we continue working together to build for 2022. I'm super excited that Delilah is going to give our presentation today. We worked with a company named Blue Labs. They just gave us our results this morning. We've been tweaking our document. So I will tell you, this is the first number crunching you're going to see from us, but it's not the last number crunching you're going to see from us. So we really wanted to get this presentation to you, but we've been working on it for the past couple of months with Blue Labs. And so there will be some tweaks and changes. So feel free to ask questions and give us input and feedback, because our goal is to make this presentation the best and most thorough presentation possible. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Delilah, who's going to run us through the numbers.
Thanks, Lily. Going to share my screen. All right. So quickly today, we'll start with an overview of our program in 2020, what we were able to do at the party. We'll go into looking at support trends across Harris County the last couple of cycles. We'll also look at some turnout trends we saw this last cycle. We'll talk a little bit about some voter registration opportunities, and then share some thoughts on a path forward for 2022. All right, so looking at our program last cycle, we ran a pretty expansive voter outreach campaign with our staff and our volunteers and our precinct chairs and all our candidates. We focused on targeting Tier 1 and Tier 4 precincts, or Tier 1 and Tier 4 targets that the TDP created. These Tier 1 targets were likely Democrats that had low turnout probability, and Tier 4 were strong Democrats that were habitual voters and always voted. And because of the pandemic, focused outreach on digital, on mail, on calling and texting voters, as we weren't canvassing in person. So we relied on SMS texts and other forms of remote voter contact, and made several attempts to voters, and contacted almost every one of our targets here in Tier 1 and Tier 4 in Harris County. But we found that some of the hardest to turn out voters might actually be reachable through canvassing. So I think that their turnout might have just been hindered because of the pandemic. So looking at some of our numbers from last year, we had 68% voter turnout across the county. We won every countywide office. We sent over 1.2 million texts to voters. We had almost 500 watching shifts, had over 160 lawyers and law students who worked as election judges and clerks. Our digital program had just under 6 million impressions. We were able to complete almost 3,000 volunteer shifts with 1,200 volunteers, made 775,000 phone calls, and mailed out voter guides, which were just a mailer with every Democratic candidate on the ticket to 686,000 households. So looking at the folks that we contacted, of the 686,000 voters that we sent mail to, 68% of them actually turned out to vote. Of the 459,000 voters that we called, 67% of them turned out to vote. And of the 753,000 folks that we texted, 72% of them turned out to vote. So a lot of folks weren't isolated and receiving mail and not a phone call, or receiving a text and not a phone call, or seeing a digital ad and not getting called. So we tried to layer all of our approaches to really impact turnout, but happy to see that we had over 65% turnout with all of our targets in the different groups. So we scaled our texting program throughout the year. You can see this chart here that we sent more texts closer to the election in November. Phones were primarily used for volunteer recruitment and for vote by mail chase, while texting were used for the folks that we probably would have canvassed. And texting was heavily used to turn out folks during early vote. And you can, from the 70-something% folks that we turned out through text, can see that talking to folks the closer it gets to the election is pretty effective. We know that follow-up is important, and we know that we have to talk to people multiple times. We can't tell someone to vote once and then leave them alone. So almost 60% of the folks that we targeted received multiple touches from us. So maybe they were called and texted and received a piece of mail and saw the digital ad, but we were able to touch our targets more than once to really impact turnout in Harris County. So unfortunately, though, while texting allows us to reach a large number of folks, it does lower our engagement. So you can see that contact rates were significantly higher in August when we had a smaller texting program than they were in October, when our program was almost entirely texting focused. I think a lot of this also has to do with just, to Jaime's point, the amount of money that came into the state late, the amount of campaigns and other organizations that ramped up late We're also texting people in the middle of the pandemic. So maybe folks were less responsive as they were being inundated with texts, but the texts were more effective and people were having conversations with us the earlier we started texting them. And important to note that we need to augment our texting outreach since it leaves some folks out of, it makes them unreachable. So newer registrants are some of the least likely voters to have a cell phone on file and often among the most difficult to turn out to vote. But relative to population size, we have the worst coverage in precincts that vote strongly Democratic. So this just means that anytime that we are engaging with voters, we should be collecting updated and accurate contact information. We need to update all of our records of cell phone numbers, of email addresses, of addresses of voters so that we're actually able to reach the folks that we're trying to reach. So a number of our targets did not have a cell phone number. So we tried to reach them through other means, but texting folks is pretty effective. So we need to update our data and get cell phone numbers for likely Democrats. Looking at support trends in 2020, we know that the entire state of Texas is becoming slightly bluer and that Harris County has been increasingly influential in that shift as the county's population has grown. While we rely on turning out diverse young and urban voters, we saw a decrease in the support from 2016, but that decrease was actually offset by gains within white voters. So recent gains are also stronger at the top of the ticket than they are locally, particularly among the very white voters who have been shifting Democratic. So local candidates have substantial votes to gain by capitalizing on the enthusiasm for national Democrats or any Democrats we have at the top of the ticket. And important to note, going back to the tiers and the models we used from the state party, that some of the partisanship models overestimated Democratic support, mostly among AAPI, Latino, and white non-college voters. We'll get into this later, but the partisanship models are not equipped to predict vote switching at the candidate level. So looking at support trends in 2020, Harris County was able to deliver double digits for state and national candidates in 2020. President Biden and Vice President Harris earned 57% of the two-way vote from Harris County, while all other candidates in the races that we looked at earned between 54% and 57%. So the composition of the electorate remained consistent since 2016, but population growth has increased Democrats' raw vote advantage. So Biden likely netted 33,000 votes over Hillary in 2016 from changes in the electorate, but both parties in 2020 gained votes through registration, but we were able to gain more, specifically 141,000 over 107,000 with Trump. And this pattern was a pattern we also saw from 2014 to 2018. So following national trends, the suburbs have shifted bluer in recent cycles. This is where we saw the largest increase in support in 2020. The suburbs, right, are becoming more diverse, more college educated, but the parties are becoming more split explicitly on race, class, and religious lines. So some of these shifts were most evident in our western suburbs and the surrounding exurbs. Biden was able to make larger and consistent gains over Hillary in 2016 in this region, while maintaining Obama levels of support in more traditionally Democratic parts, like the city of Houston proper. So compared to past cycles, Democrats slipped in diverse communities and gained in white precincts. So if we look at the first line, in 2012, 98% of the Black voters turned out to vote. In 2016, that dipped to 97%. In 2020, that dipped to 94%. If we look at Latino voters in 2012, 70% of likely Democrats turned out. In 2016, that increased to 78%, and we saw a huge dip in 2020 to 67%. AAPI voters started at 56% in 2012, a huge increase in 2016 to 65%, and a dip to 57% in 2020. But what's steady on the increase here are with white voters. So white voters who are college educated started at 29% voting for Democrats in 2012 went to 39% in 2016 and 43% in 2020. And white voters who are non-college educated were at 18% in 2012, 21% in 2016, and 24% in 2020. So a lot of the reasons why we did so well at the top of the ticket and didn't translate into flipping the state house or winning some key state house races in Harris County were due to ticket splitters, particularly in some of our white precincts. So you can see in some areas from the presidential, the folks who voted in the presidential for Biden, we lost 13,000 votes, going down to the folks who voted for MJ Hagar. But then looking at what happened on the Republican side, the folks who voted for Trump were actually, the folks who voted for Cornyn, there were 11,000 more folks who voted for Cornyn than there were who voted for Trump, meaning there were lots of folks who voted for Biden at the top of the ticket and switched to voting for Republican further down ballot. And we saw a similar trend in 2018 with Beto voters who voted for Beto at the top of the ticket, but didn't support candidates in Harris County, like the county judge at the bottom of the ticket. There was a 12-point swing in 2018 between Beto and Lena. So looking at the whether or not the model with the TDP was accurate, the chart below compares precinct level election results with predicted support among 2020 voters based on TDP partisanship scores. So the scores were actually pretty accurate for Black and white college educated voters, but they were optimistic for Latinos, AAPI voters, and white non-college educated voters, meaning that we were just talking to folks who, you know, might have been modeled as supporting Democrats, but weren't necessarily supporting Democrats who were Latino, AAPI, or white voters without college degrees. So we just overestimated where our support lied within those communities with some voters. All right, looking at turnout trends. So Harris County voters of all stripes surged the polls during the Trump era with the effect of amplifying the county's glowing baseline. Large turnout increases effectively canceled out any GOTV or get out the vote lift achieved by either party, but baseline turnout rates were highest in Republican precincts, which we'll get into later. It's important that we are achieving turnout parity with Republicans, but this will require more engagement with non-voting and newly registered voters of color, as well as younger and college-educated white voters. And the turnout model was effective for targeting voter outreach in 2020, but the TDP turnout model likely prioritized who the likeliest voters were and accurately described the composition of the electorate. So looking at Harris County turnout in 2020, of course, we had historic turnout. 2018 was the highest turnout midterm election in 25 years, but in 2020, we saw over 500,000 voters who stayed home in 2016 actually showed up to vote in Harris County. Turnout surged in groups friendly to both Democrats and Republicans. So looking at this, even though we saw college-educated voters made up a smaller share of the white electorate than they did in 2016, the population growth in Harris County means we saw 55% more raw votes come from this group. But despite different turnout rates and political leanings, population changes mean that all regions of Harris County gained net new voters compared to 2016. But the county's increasing Democratic lean and growing population translated to bigger margins for Democrats. So in 2018, we saw Democratic enthusiasm surge with Ted Cruz at the top of the Republican ticket, but both sides effectively turned out their supporters in 2020. So the net effect is a similar vote share across both parties, but the larger and larger Democratic raw vote margins were, of course, with Democrats causing us to win the county. Important to note that every time Democratic enthusiasm jumps, Republicans match us. So this chart below shows the aggregate turnout rates in the last 4 cycles by precinct level, support for Hillary Clinton, and each cycle turnout has been highest in the strongest Trump precincts and lowest in the strongest Clinton precincts. Turnout increased across the board in 2020, resulting in a similar partisanship turnout balance as 2018 and 2016. This is really just showing that our reddest precincts in Harris County saw the highest turnout in 2020. Our bluest precincts in Harris County, probably our bluest precincts that are in districts that are represented by incumbent Democratic elected officials, saw the lowest increase in turnout in Harris County, meaning that we really need to urge some of our incumbents to spend time and resources turning constituents, because those are the folks those are the areas where we can run up the score in Harris County, but those are the areas where we've significantly seen a dip in turnout across the county. The places where we're seeing the increase are the places that we would consider more flippable districts, districts that are not represented by Democratic incumbents. So if our bluest precincts had turned out in 2018 at the same rate as strong as the reddest precincts, then Democrats would have netted 63,000 more votes in those areas across the county. So turnout parity will require more participation from recent non-voters. Oh, I don't actually know how to go back. Sorry. We're going to talk about voter registration. Oh, sorry. No, I can go back. Okay, turnout parity will require more participation from recent non-voters in key communities in 2022. So again, if likely strong Democrats had turned out at the same rate as likely strong Republicans, we would have netted 178,000 more votes countywide in 2020. Most of those votes would have come from Black and Latino voters. But also important to note that we stand to gain the most votes by turning out people in their prime working years. So this is defined in this chart by like folks who are age 30 to 65 years old. Looking at voter registration, we added almost 300,000 new registrants to the rolls. We registered almost 300,000 new voters, but differing turnout rates meant that some groups of new registrants exerted more influence on the outcome than others. So engaging new registrants in the cycle they register in is critical to maximizing the electoral impacts of growing, diversifying county. The DNC's Arbor database estimates that there are over 500,000 potential voters to register in Harris County. If every estimated unregistered voter in Harris County registered and voted, we would win 64% of the two-party vote. So looking at some of the folks who registered in 2020. In 2018, we were able to gain almost as many new registrants in 2016, but our turnout rate amongst those voters were much lower. But in 2020, our turnout rates were higher than 2016, and there were more new registrants than 2016. So our net votes actually increased by about 50,000 votes from newly registered voters. As we've seen, of the 300,000 folks who were registered, there were folks who were friendly to each party. So Latino and AAPI voters increased their share of the newly registered voters since 2016, as the white share has gone down and the Black share has held steady across Harris County. But there are white non-college voters who also grew as a share of newly registered voters relative to past cycles, as the share of white college voters declined. So the increase in turnout, of course, likely amplified the results of the otherwise high turnout election rather than changing the partisan balance of the electorate. So while we did register lots of new Democrats, there were also lots of new Republicans registered, which all turned out, or lots of newly registered folks turned out to vote, which contributed to the turnout we saw in November. Turning out newly registered voters is a critical part of any registration program. If we look at this chart here, I think what's most important is that white college educated newly registered voters were most likely to turn out in 2016 and 2020, but the groups that had the similar increase in change were Black voters and AAPI voters. So of the Black voters and AAPI voters that were registered in the 2020 cycle, they had a higher turnout rate than we saw in previous cycles. Harris County, at the party, we worked with a number of grassroots and local organizations that also ran an apartment voter registration program where they were dropping off mailers to, likely Democratic apartment complexes, to voters in likely Democratic apartment complexes. Looking at the places we ran this program, we know that in Braised Oaks, of the folks that we registered from this program, 36% of them turned out. In North Katy, 52% of them turned out. In Braeswood, 64% of them turned out. And in Spring Branch, 43% of those folks turned out. So looking at the path to victory in 2022, based off of this condensed version that we just went through, we know that we need to consolidate our coalition of voters and minimize vote switching. We need to close the partisan turnout gaps. We need to register and turn out more Democrats, and we need to continue running programs that have effective field and digital outreach. So while we talk about our coalition and our turnout goals, we need to make sure that we're targeting and mobilizing low propensity Latino and Black voters. So Democratic turnout rates lag Republican turnout within most key base Democratic groups, like Black and Latino voters. Almost all of the gains Democrats could make from voter turnout would come from these two groups. So to be mobilized, Democrats tend to be more of a working age and are a bit more likely to be men. And this also goes back to the slide where a lot of these voters live in our districts that are represented by Democrats that are not voting, presumably just because there's less activity there in an election year if an incumbent is unchallenged and it's a safe Democratic seat. We also need to look at how we define persuasion in Democratic politics and who we run persuasion to get them to turn out. So of course, there are white college educated vote switchers that we saw in a lot of the suburbs in Harris County. Much of the growth in Democratic support in recent cycles have come from huge shifts among white college educated voters who supported candidates like Beto and Biden, and then went back to Republicans for offices down ballot. So down ballot Democrats in 2022 will have to persuade voters who support top of the ticket candidates to support them as well. And at the same time, they also have to make sure that they're persuading who I think we usually write off as being strong Democratic voters to make sure that they support down ballot candidates as well. So we need to shore up our support among base communities. So recent presidential cycles have set high water marks for Democratic performance among Black, AAPI, and Latino voters. So compared to past results, we have precincts with high non-white populations that have shifted right in 2020, and diverse voters of color are important persuasion targets for Democrats to work to earn continued high support in 2022. And looking at voter registration, moving into 2022, we need to make sure that we are registering, enthusiastic, likely new Democrats. And then we need to also make sure that we are registering and engaging under-engaged base communities. So, of course, Black and Latino communities across Harris County. Some other things we can do, we need to make sure that we're turning out newly registered voters in the cycle that they register to vote. So we don't want folks who are registered this year, next year, to stay on the rolls and not talk to them until 2024. So we need to make sure that we are engaging them and mobilizing them to turn out in elections that are happening as soon as they register. And we need to continue to make sure that we are layering contact on multiple modes to reach voters who are hard to reach, while ensuring that we contact voters on the media they are most likely to engage with. And of course, coming out of the pandemic, we need to make sure that we're ramping up our door-to-door canvassing efforts, because we know that that's just the best way to reach some of the hardest to reach communities. And that's all I got.
Thank you, Delilah. So we've already got some questions. I did have one lead off in terms of kind of what Lillie led off with. the concern that I think many of us share about what happened in the House races. I didn't see any specific data on that. Have you had a chance to take a look at that to try and identify why those great hopes, given the great turnout across the board, didn't pan out to actual House seat races?
Yes, sorry, that might, I think that could be answered in a couple of different slides. So there's the slide that talks about how we saw that there were a lot of ticket splitters, right? Or vote switchers, I guess some people call them, in Harris County. So lots of folks who voted for Biden at the top of the ticket who then switched to voting Republican for the rest of the ticket. There are actual hard numbers of how many votes we lost from switchers in the slide. Sorry, but I don't have that at the top of right now. But also important to look at the partisanship model that we used and understand that I think we overshot some of where we thought our support was. So the partisanship model, right, tells me whether or not I'm a voter who will support Democrats or not. But I might be a Republican who shows up on the model as being a Democrat, and there were just particularly with white non-college educated voters, Latino voters, and AAPI voters, we overestimated their support for Democratic candidates. So I think some of our targeting might have been off with within the House districts, and we probably left Democrats votes on the table if we weren't targeting the right folks. But at the same time, I think some of the folks that we did target voted for Biden at the top of the ticket, and we, they were excited about that and for that, but either didn't continue voting down ballot or voted for Republicans.
Well, and that's kind of my point. So the targeting, because I understand the partisanship model, but are you telling us that in those House districts that we aimed at the wrong people, or we didn't have enough targeting on the right people, or what's the takeaway, if you have one, from the data at this point?
I think the takeaway is that we need to fine tune some of our modeling and our targets for sure, but we also, I think that there are ways that we could run like persuasion programming and not just like turnout programming to folks that are ticket splitters.
Got it. And actually we got a question on that. Is Sri lost by a bigger margin in 2020 than 18? Is there a data explanation at this point?
I mean, I think that the biggest thing that looks at districts like that is that we have to understand, there's a slide on this too, that while we increased our turnout, we Democrats in 2018, from 2018 to 2020, so did Republicans. So I think if you're looking at CD22, there are more Republicans who voted in 22 than voted in 2018. I was looking at this once, but I don't think Biden won Harris County, but Hillary won Harris County. Fort Bend County part of 22. So there were more folks who voted for Trump in 22 than voted for Ted Cruz in 2018. So, I mean, this just goes back to, yes, there's a lot of Democratic enthusiasm on the ground and we're turning out our folks, but so are Republicans. So we just have to close the gap in the margin.
Got it. Well, and actually, I'm going to ask Lillie to turn on her. So you're off the hot seat a little bit on some of these questions, but you've handled them so well, and I appreciate it. And we have another question, kind of related, but not actually. I'm sorry. Let's slightly, because I know you've done work, and we're, I think, a senior consultant in Georgia on this last pushing over the edge in the Senate seats. Are there any particular best practices that, and this is really a structural, so it's not just for Delilah, but also for our chair, best practices that worked there that we haven't done yet? So in other words, we know what the problem is. Is there anything at this point that Lillie, you can identify, or Delilah, that what, dang, we wish we had done that you've learned or picked up or at least seen work effectively?
I'm going to let Delilah go first because Delilah worked on the ground in Georgia in 2018. And so I'm going to let her answer this question. But I also want to remind everybody that we did this election cycle during a pandemic. We had to change every which way that we contacted voters and what we're used to doing. And so while our numbers around the county were really good, we didn't do well in House seats. We stopped doing direct voter contact, which is what we have done every cycle in Harris County, except for the 2020 cycle because of the pandemic. And so I think that we did a pretty good switch to doing everything online and doing digital work and text messaging and phone calling, but it means we also didn't get to some of our base voters because they're harder to get to. just technology wise. And so I think that's something we all need to keep in mind while we're having this conversation. And then let Delilah talk about the difference. She and I have spent a lot of time talking about like what Georgia's been able to do in 18 and 20 and Texas, where Texas is in that planning process. Delilah, you want to jump into that?
Sure. I mean, I think this is like, I don't know, would require more of an answer than I can answer in like 2 minutes. But
we've got 10, so go ahead.
Yeah, in 2018 and for the runoff. I mean, I think for starters, right, Georgia has more resources than we've ever seen. So like, yes, Texas we had an influx of money come in 2020, but you could fit 5 Georgias in Texas and we still didn't have the resources that Georgia had, right, to turn out the voters we need and to do outreach everywhere in the state that we need to do. I also think that there are groups that coordinate really well together in Georgia and coordinate to ensure that they are reaching every voter and that there's less overlap and that they're being effective in their modes of outreach. And I think that there are a lot of groups who have like changed the culture of voting so that you can't really go anywhere in Georgia without seeing a sign or a message about voting. There were groups in Georgia, I told a story once about a group in Georgia who infiltrated all the nightclubs telling people to vote. And if you remember in January, there was a higher increase in Georgia in new voters than there was in November. But I think that also goes back to in the runoff, there was more resources in Georgia. So I think that there was more resources and more folks who could talk to newly registered voters to get them to turn out to vote in January than before. Because it's really uncommon, right? Newly registered voters to show up off election than it is for the general election. So I mean, I think we're on the right path. I think we could use more support financially, but I think that programs that we are running at the party, I think that programs that a lot of the grassroots organizations are running are doing the right thing, and with more resources, we could scale up and reach more folks.
So we've got a question now from Judge Kennedy that I haven't seen any data on it, but maybe you have or tease it at this point. Is there any indication from some of the metrics that you've looked at about what the effect of the ban of straight ticket voting actually meant in Harris County?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if the ban this year had much of an impact because I think the same rate at like ticket splitting we saw in 2020 was similar to what we saw in 2018.
Actually, let me stop. Is there actually, what is, because I have not seen that. Is there data that can show us where the ticket splitting was number wise in 18 versus 20?
Yeah, I think, sorry, there was a slide on this and I lost my slide deck. But I can get you exact numbers. I don't know what follow-up looks like from this conversation, but we had straight ticket voting in 2018 and we still saw lots of folks who voted for Beto and then voted for Republicans down ballot. So, I mean, I don't know if it's a matter of not having straight ticket voting and rather, you know, maybe our down ballot candidates just doing more outreach and connecting with voters on the ground.
And you know, like I said, this is not a pop quiz. It is a little bit of a math quiz, and thank you for being so patient. But what you're telling us, one of the slides, and we'll check with our chairperson, but if folks can go back and look at it, one of the slides has some indications about where the straight ticket voting impacted. In other words, here's what we saw: ticket breakers 2018 versus 2020.
Yes. Do you want me to pull that up?
Yeah, or just if you have it access. I mean, like I said, we'll with Lily's permission, we'll go ahead and share this. But if there's an indication on that, you know, okay, this is what we saw ticket splitting in 2018, where you had to manually do it as opposed to easy, versus what happened in 2020 when everybody had to do it the long way. So to speak,
yeah.
That would be helpful.
I mean, so looking at a group of white precincts in Harris County, there were 125,000 votes for Biden, but only 111,000 votes for MJ Hagar. So we lost 13,000 votes, right, going from president to Senate. But in those same precincts, there were 163,000 votes for Trump and 174,000 votes for Cornyn. So we gained 11,000 votes going from president to Senate, and a collection of white precincts in Harris County. So this is 2020. But then looking at 2018 and those same precincts, there was a 12-point swing and almost entirely made up of vote switchers. So there were only about 4,000 more voters who cast a vote for Senate than county judge in these same precincts, but Beto won by 54,000 more votes than Lena. So does that make sense?
Well, you're much better with the math than I am. Maybe, so what does that mean in practice? So we had Trump and some other folks, there were drop-offs, it sounds like, or maybe the other way around. Was their drop-off less than ours? Is that what you're telling us?
I actually think it's very similar. Like, it's very comparable. The number of folks who voted for Republican at the top, or Democrat at the top of the ticket and then switched Republican in 2020 was very similar to the same rate we saw in 2018.
Although it was obviously something you had to manually do, so to speak, in 2018.
Yes.
Got it. Okay. Lillie, I am going to try and put you on the spot a little bit. And this has to do with the question about messaging. What if there was a unified message in 2020, what do you think it was, and was it effective? Is there any metrics that we can look at to identify what was the unified message for 2020, and what do you see changing if it wasn't as effective as it needed to be?
I mean, we try at the party to work really hard with all the campaigns and all the grassroots organizations around the county to use the same messaging. We work with First Tuesday PAC to do a poll, and we have the last 2 cycles where we work with them to do a poll to produce that messaging, to make sure that we're, talking to people about issues that matter to them, not just the issue that Mike Doyle might care about or Delilah might care about, but the majority of Democrats will care about. And we work with them on the poll and then share the messaging with all of our groups and share it as far and wide as possible. I think last election cycle, it was the COVID, it was pandemic and economy and pandemic and economy. And we talked about that over and over and over again. I do think that, as we transition out of the pandemic, it's going to be really interesting to see how we kind of do a deep dive into our messaging. And we're going to work with all of the groups around the state that are spending a lot of resources to do a lot of polling to make sure that we're back on message again. I think the coming out of the pandemic is just it's just a shift for everybody. And we're going to have to make sure that we as the Democratic Party are in tune with our voters. And so we are going to work on a poll for that for 2022 as well. I think that a lot of people are invested in making sure that 2022 is a good election cycle, and staying on message is incredibly important. And when we all work together, we all have to work together to make sure that we're all moving in the same direction. And it's why we try to spend so much time working with other organizations and the 35 clubs that we have in Harris County, along with organizations like Sisters United and Swing Left and Indivisible and Texas Organizing Project, and all the different groups that are the progressive organizations that have boots on the ground that are doing the work, and make sure that we all have a pretty similar message targeted to our different communities that we talk to, and we're all moving forward together. So
we've got time for 2 more questions and maybe a little bit more. One of them is fairly specific, and it's kind of a similar to the Georgia best practices, and it was a reference to Travis County and what, because at least in the House districts and what happened in Travis County, obviously Travis County is not Harris County. I always tell folks that, Austin, when you go to Taqueria, that they wish it was authentic as Houston. They're trying to be like us, they just don't want to be us. But in terms of kind of the outreach and driving folks to the polls that voted, things work pretty well there across that whole county. Is that an example? Is there anything that you've seen or had an opportunity to view, for example, in Travis County or elsewhere, best practices that you see being implemented in Harris County?
I mean, let's keep in mind this last election cycle, we were able to do a few things in Harris County that looked more like Travis County when it comes to opening up the polls during the election period. I'm going to throw some of your question out the window because Travis County and Harris County have nothing in common. We are dramatically larger and more diverse than them. And so they're doing some great things that we're absolutely looking at them and doing more online voter registration training. But we're a radically different county than they are. And so I do want Delilah to talk a little bit about how we are looking at best practices for voter registration. I see that Sherry Matula asked a question that I think actually ties into this,
Well,
in that we're going to
question,
talk.
so, yeah.
We're going to talk about voter registration and then talk about how we're going to register voters in the Democratic precincts at the precinct level that we need to, and then also turn them out so that we have a right turnout in 2022. Delilah, will you talk a little bit about VR?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also, I mean, we could fit a few Travis counties in Harris County. So like, I think when we're thinking about these things, we should really consider, you know, the size of Harris County and that we're massive. We had more folks who voted early in Harris County on the first day of early vote than voted in the entire state of Georgia on the first day of early vote, but both had, you know, crazy turnout rates on the first day of early vote. I know that in Travis County, they have some pretty dedicated staffers who do a lot of outreach with community groups, who do a lot of work identifying different events and opportunities for voter registration that I don't think we always had in Harris County, but I'm confident that our new elections administrator, Isabel Longoria, and us are working to create just a similar structure here. I mean, the previous executive director from the Harris County Democratic Party, DJ, is now in Isabel's office working to hire staff who will be on the ground registering voters yearly with the county's office. And we haven't always had that in Harris County, and Travis County has. So I think that will make a difference moving, you know, into the next cycle. Yeah, I don't.
Matula's question about, okay, once they're registered, what's the follow through plan?
Well,
Or methodology?
Yeah, and I think this goes back to a couple of slides too about how we have really bad cell phone data on a lot of likely Democratic voters. I think when you're registering voters, I know there are folks on this listening to this webinar who know about some best practices of having like a commit card or some sort of form to take personal contact information so that we can email folks and text folks and follow up with them. You know, any way that we can collect that data and then follow up with people about voter information is effective. With this report, though, we also are working on compiling a list of some key precincts that we do need to ramp up turnout and registration work in across Harris County. And I saw a few questions that were all asking about which districts these were in, but I mean, this could be defined as, somebody asked about congressional districts. I think it's more so like state house districts than congressional districts if we're looking at the county and what is solidly blue and what is solidly red. And all of those places are places that we should just be doing more work in. I know that in Harris County, the two communities that have the lowest voter registration, or sorry, maybe not the lowest voter registration numbers, the highest amount of folks who could be registered to vote and are not, are in Greenspoint and A-Leaf. So lots of opportunity there if there are voter registration groups that want to register folks there.
All right, thanks. And we're almost exactly on time, which we're very happy with it when doing our webinars. But we've got time for either or both of y'all if you have any closing thoughts. I've got the one which I think a few lawyers have heard: send more money. It will do better things. But in terms of the practical aspect, if there's anything else in terms of the metrics, and like I said, we'll check with Lillie, but this will be available on our Facebook page with all the other recordings from the past webinars, and as well as whatever slides y'all feel comfortable sharing. We'll make sure they're up within the next 24 hours as well. But let me turn it over to either Lillie or Delilah. Thank you so much. And what else do y'all want to add before we sign off?
I mean, I just want to add that campaigns are year round and that the 2022 election is already underway. Even though we have to get through a primary, we have tons of time to engage our voters around the county. And so I just want to encourage everyone here, if you're not a sustaining member, become a sustaining member. If you don't want to make a donation to the party, a financial one, we'll take your time. And that's just as important to us. Right now, we're currently calling members in the Texas legislature to make sure they know how we're feeling about things. There's always something to do. And let me rephrase that. There's more than enough for us to do. We're always looking for people to help. So please go to our website, harrisdemocrats.com, and get signed up for our newsletter and become involved in the party, because we need more and more people to make sure that we win in 2022. And with that, I'm gonna let Delilah close it out.
I would just encourage folks to be involved with the party, to urge their electeds and their representatives to also be involved campaigning, and really just to work within your own community and with your own family and make sure that the folks that you know and have access to are also voting and engaged in the electorate.
Thank you all very much. Also, thank you to Jaime for sharing some of the data on Sisters United, to Hassan for shining a spotlight. And if you're going to call, we as lawyers and non-lawyers know that this is a really big deal that's being attempted at the Court of Appeals. And this is a really good excuse to reach out, not just to the friendly, but even the unfriendly legislators to say, look, this is something we're paying attention to. Last thing I'll sign off with is just a reminder, we'll have one more webinar, but we're back live June 24th at Hotel Zaza. Maybe one of the first events, we'll see, but we're gonna have a hybrid event, so everybody will have their level of comfort, but we're looking forward to seeing as many folks as possible out live June 24th for what already promises from the committee to be an incredible event. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you all next month. Thank you.